This video is going to be looking at some of the early challenges that Tiberius faced in his rule. It's based around some mutinies in the army and a particular rebellion by a guy called Tacrophanus. So you need to find in your source books this particular section on Tiberius, looking at these sources are loads of Tacitus and some short sections from Velleius. The first section of Tacitus that we're going to have a look at is going to be looking at the mutinies of some legions in Pannonia, and then it's going to go on to and have a look at the mutinies of legions in Germany, which also Velleius will talk about. It's a very long section of Tacitus. It's not the longest section of Tacitus you'll be looking at, but it is a long section. So we start at the beginning. So much for state affairs and capital. So this is talking about sort of the death of Augustus. Now came an outbreak of mutiny among the Pannonian legions. Straightforward. And he's going to go through some of the reasons why the Pannonian legions decided to rebel. So there's no fresh grievances. So the point Tacitus is making here is that the things that are wrong in the army have been wrong in the army for a really, really long time. And this is despite Augustus's reforms to the army, there were still some issues which he will outline. And he says that only the change of sovereign, so basically Augustus dying and Tiberius taking over, had excited a vision of licensed anarchy and hopes of the emollients of civil war. I'm really sorry about this translation, it's absolutely awful. So basically, the opportunity came because Tiberius takes over. Fine. They're stationed in different places. They're under this command of this guy who's going to make mention quite a few times. And these had come at the end of Augustus' accession of Tiberius. And the commander had basically sort of relaxed some of the duties they were doing, because the armies were kept very busy by Augustus to make sure they were disciplined and that they weren't causing any problems. So he suspends that kind of discipline, and that's when things start to go wrong. So the ranks grow insubordinate, and quarrelsome, so again really unhappy, give hearing to any glib agitator, became eager and short for luxury and ease, disdainful of discipline and work. So you should get the impression here that Tacitus doesn't particularly like the soldiers who decided to mutiny, mainly because they were from a working class background. They're not sort of aristocrats, and Tacitus basically thinks they're a bit stupid. One of the agitators is this guy here, and he sort of acts in quite a demagoguery way. So he gives lots of speeches, and he plays on those simple minds. Like I said, Tacitus doesn't like the army, he thinks they're really, really thick. And he sort of plays on this doubt of how the passing of Augustus could affect the conditions of service, even though the conditions weren't very good anyway. And he's kind of playing on the fact that we got Tiberius, and a lot of these soldiers would have served under Tiberius and know that he's quite strict, and there might have been a little bit of a concern that maybe the conditions that have been lax after the death of Augustus might be reimposed really strictly. So they become ready to fight, and he's got loads of people supporting behind him, and he gives this speech, and I've only picked out a couple of bits from the speech. So he's sort of talking to the army, why should they obey like slaves, a few centurions and fewer tribunes? So he's sort of saying, they're being acting like slaves. I don't know why I'm trying to re-explain, that's pretty obvious what he's trying to say. There's the bit, there's an unstable throne of a new prince, so there's also question marks around Tiberius. It's talking about here how they're really old and sort of still being forced to fight, and they're really unhappy about it. In fact, even when they do retire, they're given some really awful farm, in inverted commas, in some sort of swampy land or barren mountainside. So their retirement, what they get after they've served, is not very good either. And in fact, the whole trade of war was comfortless and profitless. They've been struggling for a long time. They can't buy weapons, tents, clothes. They have to bribe sort of centurions who are treating them really badly. And then they are sort of treated really badly, so they're whipped, and there's like really horrible weathers. And it's just awful. And time in the army is really, really difficult. They don't get much pay. And that's why they're unhappy. So this whole speech kind of gives you some problems within the army, which is quite useful for issues within the Republic, within the Principate. So the crowd is listening to him are really happy, showing their sort of marks of the lash. So it kind of shows that obviously these guys were being beaten up by their centurions, that they're really old, not really old, but they're going grey and they're sort of struggling. And they sort of suggest that they formulate the three legions into one, and that's going to be sort of essentially the rebellion starts. Some people turn up in here. And then this new arrival brings fresh life to the mutiny. Then you've got outlying districts began to run by wandering marauders, so they're going around attacking like local areas. So the commander who I mentioned at the top, he sort of tries to take control, and he sort of, those who've been particularly heavy laden with booty, he's the ones who've been stealing lots of stuff, are lashed and thrown into the cell. So he's trying to use discipline, like harsh discipline, to get control of the mutiny. And it doesn't really work out very well, because the crowd sort of flew to the rescue of these particular guys, and these prisoners are freed. So this is all going really badly wrong in the army. This mutiny is growing out of control. And then after this, the flames burn brighter. Sedation found fresh leaders. There's more leaders come in, which is what this section is talking about. And it's this guy who sort of continues to sort of stir up the people. You notice I'm skimming over bits of this because it's Tacitus, and he obviously likes to go into minute detail about what was happening, who said what. I would suggest reading it through properly. There's nothing in here, I don't think, that this soldier says that the earlier soldier hasn't said already. So, he says, put to death by the hands of the gladiators he keeps for arms and extermination of his soldiers. So basically the over-discipline by this guy is proving difficult. It's not stopping the mutiny, is the basic point. So if you want to pick out stuff from there, by all means do, but I'm going to skip over it. So what we do have is that this guy here has got an inflammatory affective speech. So he's weeping and striking his face and breast. So he's obviously whipped up the crowd. And people obviously are very unhappy. And they start kind of attacking some of the centurions. So there's this centurion here, Lucius, who's killed. He had a nickname called Fetch Another, because he kept breaking a cane over a private's back, then calling on top for another one, and then another one. So this shows how horrifically these soldiers had been being treated, which is why they're rebelling in the first place. So what we should be aware of is that this army is not rebelling because Tiberius has come to the throne. That's like a pretext for it, gives them the opportunity. They're rebelling because they're just really unhappy, because they're being, treated really badly, and they're getting an absolutely appalling sort of veterans pension at the end of it. So just be aware of that. We can't say that these armies are rebelling because of Tiberius, but obviously it doesn't make his accession very easy because they are rebelling, if you see what I mean. Hopefully that kind of makes sense somewhere in between those sentences. And anyway, more parts of the army start to come on, to possibly starting to rebel as well. And there's very different centurions trying to intercept and try and kill off the ringleaders, and it's again, none of this is going particularly well. So then Tiberius is told. So he decides to send out his son Drusus. So remember, Tiberius has two sons. He has his actual son Drusus, and he has Germanicus, who was his adopted son, who is his nephew, who he's forced to adopt by Augustus. So he sends out his actual son Drusus, and he goes out with some nobles and some praetorians, and he's basically given no particular instructions, just to suit his measures to the emergency. So in other words, do what you got to do to get these guys under control. Fine. So also who goes out with him is a guy called Sejanus. So at this particular point, Sejanus is just a person in the army. Sejanus is going to become very, very important later. As Tacitus points out here, he exercised remarkable influence over Tiberius. At this particular point, he doesn't have a lot of influence over Tiberius, but he's going to have a massive influence on him. So that's why he is sent out. And then we have Drusus approaches the legions, and they sort of mark their loyalty. Drusus is quite popular at this particular point as well. He comes across as quite an alright guy. So he's met kind of quite respectfully by the legions. So he goes into the camp here, and the mutineers, are sort of have been really shouty and like, yeah, we're mutinying, woo. And then they see Caesar, as in Drusus, and they tremble. They're slightly worried about what's going to come next. So Drusus reads a letter from Tiberius, where Tiberius says he had personally a special regard for the heroic legions in those companies who borne so many campaigns, because he had been general of the army. And as soon as his thoughts found a rest from grief, i.e. after the death of Augustus, he would state their case to the conscript fathers, the Senate. Meantime, he had sent his son to grant without delay any reforms that could be conceded on the spot. The others must be reserved for the Senate. So he says, I'm going to listen to your problems. Drusus has my permission to basically sort out the issue, and what he can say yes to at the time he will, and others must go towards the Senate in order to be decided from that particular point. And the body will do to reflect, which could be really nice, they could sort of agree to everything and say, or they could be really horrible and decide to punish the army. Either way, it's down to Drusus and the Senate, it's not Tiberius. So is this another example of Tiberius maybe not wanting to be, at centre of power and be an emperor? Is he kind of passing on responsibility to other people? Or is he sending the right person to do the right job? Don't know. So anyway, what we then have is Drusus is in the camp. You see I've skimmed over quite a lot of this particular paragraph, and I'm just rereading it again. There's always something about the weather, the planets or something. I don't know what Tacitus is really going on about. I think some omens possibly going on in the background. And what Drusus realises that he must put this kind of ominous tension to good use, and he should sort of take the opportunity, which is what he does. So he sort of orders some tents to be made, and then they kind of put each other all around the camp, sort of suggesting hope and emphasising fear. So otherwise, what's Drusus going to do? And they start to so the mutinists start to question themselves. How long must we besiege the son of our emperor? What is the end? What are we going to do? What's going to happen? So it's quite a clever tactic. It's kind of not divide and conquer, but he's obviously just kind of putting a little bit of doubt into their minds by setting up these sort of tents all over the camps and sort of waiting. And as a result, they start to. Under the influence of the mutual suspicions, they separate more from recruit from veteran, legion from legion. So they start to separate out, and the instinct of obedience starts to return because they're not being badly treated anymore. The killings by the centurions are stopped, and Drusus is just kind of waiting. So things start to calm down a little bit overnight. So at the break of day, Drusus, he calls a meeting, and he sort of says, he's not to be cowed, he said, by intimidation or by threats. So he's not going to give them what they want if they threaten him, but if he sees them returning to their duty, if he heard them speaking in the language of suppliants, he'd write to his father and advise him to lend an indulgent ear to the prayers of the legions. So if they start to behave themselves and do what they're meant to do, he's going to write to Tiberius and say, yeah, they're unhappy, but they are obedient, and maybe Tiberius will then listen to what they say. So obviously the mutineers think that's a great thing, understandably, and say, yes, please do so. And so they send this guy, he's everywhere, off to try and sort of spread some news. There's a conflict of opinions within the mutineers about what to do, because obviously if they're sort of preying on a bit of a hope here and it might not work out. And they're slightly taken aback a bit later because Drusus has a natural bias towards severity. So these two gentlemen are summoned and their execution is ordered. So a couple of ringleaders are then killed. So they're sort of being offered kind of the carrot on one side, and you've also got the stick being used. So he's using both kind of methods to try and get the army back under control. We're nearly done with this particular section of Tacitus. So then we have other ringleaders are really unhappy about the fact that these guys have been killed. Their bodies have been left out to be viewed. They sort of run away from the camp and then cut down by centurions or the Praetorian Guard. And as a result, essentially, the rest of the army is forced into line, and Drusus is happy since everything is settled, and he goes back to Rome. So the mutiny could have been really serious, but ultimately it was dealt with very successfully by Drusus, with that mixture of promising one thing and then sort of killing off the ringleaders on the other hand. So then we have Vellius's version of a very similar incident, if not the same incident, actually. I don't know why I'm saying similar. It's the same thing. Now, remember, Vellius is a big fan of Augustus and his family. He sort of writes the history of Rome, spends 3/4 of the book on Augustus, and then the rest of the family comes after. So he really likes Tiberius because Tiberius is the one who comes after Augustus. So we have to keep in mind what he says. But fortunately, it's quite easy to read, and there's some really good quotey bits to have. So the nation's prayers and wisdom were rapidly rewarded. So that's basically Tiberius comes in, isn't it brilliant? And what we do then have is the army, which is campaigning in Germany, is simultaneously taken over by a mad and overwhelming desire to cause chaos by demanding a new commander, a new constitution, and a new republic. So Vellius is suggesting it wasn't just about the terms of the service, which is down here, but it's also about that there might have been some republicans within it and wanted to get rid of, obviously, an emperorship. That might well be true. So between the two of Tacitus saying it's just about terms and conditions, and Velius saying it's sort of about terms and conditions and it's about the Republican ideals, there's probably truth between the middle of the two of them. Anyway, so they threaten to impose the demands on the Senate, so basically threatening they're going to take over. They want to fix their own level of pay in terms of their engagement, so that ties in with what Tacitus has said already. And it would appear that they're ready to fight, and it's about to become a full-scale mutiny. So this could be really dangerous to Tiberius's rule. They've got lots of followers. However, we have Tiberius's long experience as an army commander soon calmed their fury and put an end to this general breakdown of military discipline. So obviously this is Tiberius solves the problem, not anybody else, which we know from reading Tacitus up here that it's Drusus who does this, not Tacitus. Not Tacitus at all, but not Tiberius, sorry. So we have many punished severely, well we know that. Some are bought off by promises, we know that as well. So the combination of severe sanctions against the ringleaders and limited measures against the rest settled the matter. So this ties in quite nicely with what Tacitus has said in terms of the treatment of the army that have been mutinying. The only thing he's not done is mention Drusus in the slightest. And then there is another mutiny, which is where Germanicus becomes involved, which is going to be down in this source. So we've got Germanicus's handling of another mutiny had been fairly vigorous, but Drusus had the recourse to be more traditional and old-fashioned severity, which again matches up with what Tacitus has said about killing off the ringleaders. He chose to suppress the mutineers with the same brute force as they had themselves used to threaten him. I'm not sure they had really threatened him, but I guess it's tying into that kind of argument. So what we do have here is obviously problems with Tiberius coming to the throne, sorry. But we also have evidence of the use of the imperial family in the administration of Rome. So you've got Drusus, and then we've got to look at what Germanicus is doing, and Germanicus being used to calm the mutinies in the army, which helps solidify Tiberius's rule. So again, these sources can be used in multiple different places. Right, then we have another chunky section of Tacitus. So this time there's another mutiny, this time's in Germany. And these are in larger numbers and with proportionate fury. So these guys are even angrier because there's more of them, and it's for the same reasons as the Pannonian ones. So this is showing that there are problems within the army in terms of their treatment and their terms and conditions. Okay. Oh, excuse me. Right. So we do have Germanicus sort of given the supreme command at this time of the army in general. And he at this time has been out in Gaul looking at some provinces. And hang on, I'm just reading it all the way through. So again, these guys have been let off with some sort of less discipline after the death of Augustus, and they decide to start rebelling once they hear that Augustus has died. Hence why they had lesser duties. Tacitus has written it the long way around. And again, he has this argument that the soldiers who are mutinying are just really stupid and ignorant because they've got simple minds. And they're saying the time may come when the veteran should seek his overdue discharge. So it's the same thing. They've got not enough pay, they're in for too long, and they've got the cruelty of the centurions. It's the same problem completely. So we've got another mutiny. Again, it's not about necessarily the fact that Tiberius has come to the throne. It's just the timing that Tiberius has come to the throne. They have less discipline as a result of it because of this mourning time, sorry. And that's when the soldiers take the opportunity. So you'll notice I'm skipping over all sorts of stuff in this section because it's very, very repetitive of what's happened previously. So you have varying different commanders sort of attacking and sort of lashing people, and people being attacked, which is really quite gross. What we do have is that basically the camps have got no authority, so the mutiny is really bad and everyone is really angry. That is the gist of that paragraph. And then we've got Germanicus is basically sent out to deal with the situation. And he enters the camp where these legions are, and there's loads of complaints sort of are told at him. Then there's this really weird section of Tacitus I'm going to read to you because the image is really grim. So some of the men kissed his hand with a pretense of kissing it, pushed the fingers between their lips so he could touch their toothless gums. That is not an image I needed, Tacitus. I think essentially what he's trying to say is obviously these guys have been really badly treated and the health's really bad, so they sort of pretend to kiss the hand and shove his hand into their mouths in order so he could tell that they've got no teeth. It's just really gross. Others showed him limbs bent and bowed with age. So, these guys are struggling, they're suffering, and this is what they're telling Germanicus, we're being badly treated, and what are we going to do? We need to be treated better and to sort us out. So Germanicus starts to speak, and he gives a pious tribute to the memory of Augustus, of course he does, and then he changed to the victories and the triumphs of Tiberius, because remember, a lot of these soldiers would have served under Tiberius as well, and he particularly talks about sort of the victories that he won, and that he had enlarged the unanimity of Italy and the loyalty of the Gallics. So in fact we'll highlight that, because that's very good, successful stuff for Tiberius. Sorry, my computer's being silly. There we go. So that's great. So these sort of like, yes, Augustus is amazing. Tiberius is also amazing. Essentially, why are you mutinying? So they listen to that and they start to murmur amongst themselves, kind of going, why are you telling us all this? We know about this. What about our problems? And then he touches on the mutiny, and that's what their soldiery, obedience, where the discipline, where wants their glory. So, you guys used to be this amazing fighting force, and now look at you. What's going on? Where's your obedience? Where you fought for Augustus, you fought to fight Tiberius when he was one of the commanders, and now what you're doing? You've driven out your tribunes, they're your centurions, they're sort of acting like sort of crazy people, and this doesn't really please them, so they sort of taunt him with the fees for exemption from duty, the miserly rate of pay, and the severity of the work. So again, it's the same problems that were causing the Pannonian legions to rebel, and they're saying, you don't understand, this is what's going on, and it gives you a list of the sort of jobs they were having to do. So they were parapet making and trenching, that's digging out trenches, they were collecting forage, building materials and fuel, there's other camp drudgeries, sometimes just stop them being lazy, and they're just really unhappy. They'd had 30 or more campaigns, they're really tired, they sound tired, and they don't want to be going into old age sort of basically poor, with really poor life chances, because they've got no money, and they just kind of want to be settled and, deal with it. And I think, to be fair, they probably have a point. It does sound like it was pretty awful conditions. So he hears all this. So he leaps from the platform where he's giving his speech. They blocked his way, and he sort of exclaims he'd rather die soon than turn into a traitor, and tries to stab himself. And he's stopped from doing so. And as a result, let me read it all the way through. Someone sort of suggests they could do it for him, but either way, his friends sort of rush him into his tent. So this is sort of Germanicus, maybe being a little bit over dramatic, but probably quite upset about the situation. At the same time, we have another attempt to mutiny from another group of soldiers, but this one was repressed by the summary execution of other soldiers, and this guy here had ordered their death. But the wave of disorder started to grow, so he flees. So literally there's like these pockets of mutinies all over the place. And Germanicus hasn't been able to deal with all of this because he's threatened to kill himself and hasn't been allowed to do so. Then the Senate sends a deputation, and they find Germanicus, who is kind of returned by then at the altar. So he's at a temple. Sorry, I'm just reading it through. And the mutiny army starts to get worried. Their fear overcame that senatorial commission had arrived to revoke all the concessions extorted by the rebellion. So they're worried that the Senate's going to overturn basically what Drusus had kind of promised Pannonian legions and what might be promised to the Germanian legions. Whew. So they sort of particularly blame this senator, which is a bit harsh, and they force the door, drag him. Oh no, sorry. And before, let me read it all the way through. I'm skipping sentences. And then before the end of the night, they basically seize Germanicus, there we go, and they compel him on the pain of death to hand over Plancus, there we go, it doesn't make any sense. And they're going around kind of trying to find this guy, and it's all a little bit ridiculous. And then Germanicus arrives in the camp again, because he's been elsewhere, and essentially does also blame Plancus for what has happened. I'm just rereading it. Either way, he has to deal with the situation. Right, there we go. So during this particular semi-little mini rebellion within the rebellion, not to confuse you, Germanicus is universally blamed for not proceeding to the upper army. So he doesn't go. They think he doesn't go and talk to the right people, and I don't think Germanicus really knows what to do, because he's hearing all these problems and he's like, what on earth am I going to do? I can't promise these guys anything. I can't seem to put it down. Me being there, being Germanicus, hasn't really helped. Also, to complicate everything, he's brought his wife and his child with him, and his wife is pregnant. So we've got Agrippina, who already has like a toddler, and she's pregnant with her second child. So he sort of sees them because they've arrived, and he bursts into tears, embraces their little kids, and sort of sends them on the way. So he sends Agrippina away with his infant son, and he sort of drags himself away because he's like, what are we going to do? So this is not quite the picture of Germanicus they were expecting. They're a little bit taken aback of, like, he's sobbing and wailing. He's absolutely destitute, upset, and they're like, what on earth is happening? Why are you so upset? We don't understand what the issue is. I mean, these guys will be protected. And he's basically doing it to kind of make a point. Felt shame and pity the memories of her father Agrippa and of Augustus her grandfather. So they're treating, the family of these great people really, really badly. And it's like, oh, hang on a second, what are we doing? This is really bad. She must come back, she must stay. And they try and bring her back to Germanicus. And he sort of stands in the middle of all of this and is just like, look, I'm removing them from your madness. I prefer it to be expiated my own blood only. So he's like, I'm trying to save my wife and my child's life. I'll give my blood, but I'm not giving their blood. You should not tremble your guilt by butchering the great-grandson of Augustus and murdering the daughter-in-law of Tiberius. So he's playing on this kind of family link. These guys are related to Augustus and Agrippa. They're going to, you're going to murder them, so I've sent them away because what choice have I got? Kill me, but don't kill them. So maybe a little element here of kind of like laying on the guilt trip going on. And he sort of gives more speech and sort of says, in the past, a glance from Augustus, and the legions of Actium quailed. So this is when there was the Brundisium mutiny after the Battle of Actium, and Augustus basically went and spoke to them and gave them money and dealt with the problem. And he's kind of going, you listened to Augustus, this army, and it was fine. And you have shared his many fields, talking about Tiberius, and thrived on his many bounties. You've really benefited from Tiberius and Augustus's rule, and this is kind of how you're treating his family. His own recruits, his own veterans are not sated yet with money and dismissals. So nothing we're doing is pleasing you, and yet what are you doing? You're killing centurions, you're ejecting tribunes, you're imprisoning other generals, and everywhere's covered in blood. So what am I going to do with all this? My short-sighted friends, you wrench away the steel I was prepared to lunge my breast. I was willing to kill myself over this, and I would have done it, and I wouldn't have guilty about it, and yet you're unhappy with what's happening because you can't be pleased. Which is basically what this speech is all about. So he's laying on this kind of guilt, and then he carries on with more guilt, and then he bursts into tears because he's upset. And despite all of this, the temper of the soldiers remains savage, and they can't seem to calm themselves down either. Oh dear me, this goes on forever. And then Germanicus is there, and he's sort of still playing on the guilt, essentially, is going on. He sort of goes to where Varius had been destroyed in his first camp, in order to kind of, I think, show, these great legions had been really honourable. They'd been killed, but they had been honourable because they'd been doing what Augustus had told them to do. So sort of, if they continue to mutiny, they're insulting the standards and the eagle. I think that's the point that's being made in here. And essentially, at this particular point, this starts to calm the mutiny down. And although Tiberius disapproves, possibly because he put an invidious construction on all acts of Germanicus, so maybe Tiberius was a little bit sort of wary of Germanicus's general popularity. But what we do end up with eventually is this particular rebellion is quelled by Germanicus, possibly by blaming on guilt, but possibly by listening to the soldiers' unhappiness. Just skimming through to the end. Oh, we're nearly there. We're nearly there. Right, so that's the sort of mutinies within the varying armies all around Pannonia and Germany. At the same time, roughly, there is also a rebellion, not within the army, but in Africa. And we have this guy here of Tacfarinas. I can't say his name properly. So he recruits his forces in the heart of Africa. And he basically is demanding land for himself and his army, and he's threatening a war to gain it. Fine. And by all means, no sorts of the nation of stung Emperor more than is spectacular. Hang on. So Tacfarinas had been fighting under Tiberius earlier on. So he's a deserter. He's not a mutiner, he's a deserter. Hang on, let me do that bit as well. So he's really unhappy about this because this guy had been fighting within the army, has deserted, and is now threatening to sort of, attack the state. Sorry, I'm just rereading what the section says. And he says, not even Tacitus, not even Spartacus made such a big demand, so he's really unhappy about it all. So he hands over the army to the affair to this particular guy, so he's back, and he's told basically to capture the leader by any means, whatever. It's always the sentence, go and do what you got to do. And so this guy goes across and essentially starts a war with Tacfarinas. So he's overmatched in solid fighting strength, or more expert in the petty knaveries of war, operated with a number of bands, first attacking then vanishing. So basically the Tacfarinas uses guerrilla tactics, and as a result is quite successful initially. And then this guy here marches his own division across. He builds a chain of forts. This is a whole explanation of how he divides up his army, which I haven't highlighted because I don't find it particularly interesting. You might do. And he keeps hounding Tacfarinas from one camp to another. And he doesn't finish it, but he just sort of disperses the problem. So Tiberius chose to treat it as ended, even conferred on, I think it's Balasus, privilege of being saluted imperator by his legion. So he gets sort of the honour of being imperator, so commander, gets honour, and Tiberius kind of writes it that it is finished. Now, really irritatingly, in Tacitus's book, he talks about similar events the same event happening at different times in the different parts of the book. So earlier in the book, if you'll notice by the number, this is in the chapter before, he also mentions the Tacfarinas, or however you say it, rebellion. So we have another sentence that points it out, and that he had raised an army, basically. And again, there's some bits about kind of what they've been doing, so going around attacking places and different legions. I mean, what you remember in section A is they're not going to ask you like a source passage question on this. So if you want to read this, do, because it does give you a description of basically how Tacfarinas is kind of dealt with and what he's doing. But in reality, the important thing is there's a rebellion. And again, later on in the book, he mentions him again have hostility in Africa by doing raids and destruction of villages and by plunder. So it's showing that this guy is causing problems, and that he sort of attacks a Roman cohort. But ultimately, the rebellion is put down, which is the important thing for us from the sources. So you don't need to necessarily, I don't think, know the ins and outs of what Tacfarinas is doing in Africa. What we do have, if I will highlight that, hang on, is Tiberius is sending out these guys to deal with them, and they generally are quite successful, and they sort of stop the rebellions going on. I didn't mean to highlight that bit there. There we go. Anyway, so that is essentially it. So there's lots of rebellions. You have one in Africa. You have one in Germany, which is all of this, delightful source. and then all the way back up, all the way back up, all the way back up. Oh, it's a long source. And then we have the ones in the Pannonian legions. So you could use this as evidence to show that Tiberius maybe wasn't that popular, because obviously once he came to the throne, all the armies rebel. Not all of them, sorry. Some of the armies rebel. But as I said, throughout the source, it's more about the conditions they were fighting under, not necessarily that Tiberius himself had come to the throne. The change of leadership is more like an opportunity for them to rebel, not necessarily because it was Tiberius himself. And the fact is that Tiberius did deal with these rebellions not easily, but quite straightforwardly. He sent out his family, so we've got evidence of the use of his family. He deals with rebellions very quickly, because his rebellions don't go on for that long, and then he's a little bit more settled into his throne. But that is it for these particular sources that we have to look at on his challenges to his early rule.